So, hello and welcome, guys. Cyber Diaries episode number 22. We have another amazing guest in our studio, Jake Bernardis from Anecdotes GRC. So, welcome, Jake, on board.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Marius.
Yeah, no problem. Good for having you. I guess, starting, you obviously you ended up working at currently at Anecdotes, and it's always fascinating, I guess, to look at various aspects because obviously we know cybersecurity is such a broad perspective and such a broad field. So looking from GRC's perspective, and I guess that's where you ended up now currently. In such a crowded field, can you just kind of give an overview? What does Anecdotes do in terms of in GRC space, and how you guys, I guess, approaching it? Because obviously, I see, there's different tools or there's different ways companies trying to approach this I guess, area. So if you could just give us an overview a bit.
Yeah, let me unpick that. It's a long question, but let me unpick that. I think there's been iterations in GRC over time. I think you started with the manual requirements, right? Someone said, here's SOC 2, here's ISO 27001, here's the list of all the controls, column A. Column B was what is the actual requirement. Column C, you answered what your response was, and column D, you maybe referenced where the evidence was or attached a link or whatever, right? And then you saw a starting to move towards consolidating this into a single accessible space. Like you look at that concept in reality and you start to think, well, if that employee leaves, the data leaves with them. What if there's files are saved over here, but we lose that? Like there was all kinds of issues. So you looked at the rise of kind of things like Zen GRC back about 8, 9, 10 years ago. They started to say, well, actually, they're still just a manual tool, but they're in a single web UI, accessible through collaboration. There was some cross mapping where if you uploaded this control, it would also automatically cross map and upload to ISO. And you started to see some kind of levels of automation. You've then seen two different approaches in enterprise, right? At the lower end of the food chain, a kind of startup SMB, you've seen big plays in the automation space. Drata and Vant are the two big names, where what they've done is said, well, actually, if you look, you can connect a tool via API from your security stack. So your AWS infrastructure, your Azure, your GCP. Maybe it's your training platforms like your Nova4 or something like that. Maybe it's your HR system. Maybe it's your vulnerability management system. Connect them on, and they can go against relevant controls, and we can effectively run a test via API and say yes or no, do they pass or not, right? Which is fine. At the enterprise level, that doesn't really work, right? So they've still been legacy customers of stuff like Archer and ServiceNow and SAP and those kind of things that have been there for a long time that do a lot of stuff, right? Massive platforms, but take a lot of customization, usually a lot of consulting time, and a lot of manual work, right? So you've got SMB start place doing automation, click a button and it goes. You've got big enterprise doing really complex manual work. Anecdote is the middle. So what we did is took the concepts that we saw in automation. So this idea that you can connect tools via API to a security platform, Anecdotes, and you can run the evidence that applies to relevant controls inside of it. And you can therefore automate the process to allow auditors to see it. Now, why we're different is that instead of being what we say is result-led, so classic example, you run a test to AWS, AWS says encryption at rest is turned on in the admin console, green tick, right? That's how it works in a lot of our competitors. We went evidence-led. So what that means is we don't just say you're ready for audit. We actually post the evidence in the control. Now, why that's different is it means that we are enterprise ready. We have Fortune customers, the guys who want to be audited by the likes of Shellman or Coalfire in the US, Deloitte, PwC, KPMG in the UK, who aren't going to look at a kind of Drata, Vanta or other players' platform and see that as being sufficient, who still want the evidence, who still want that customization. The other thing that we do very differently to others is we write everything custom. So all our APIs are custom code. Now, why that's relevant is when you think about the reality of connecting your infrastructure to a compliance platform, there's all kinds of security concerns, right? Least privilege comes straight away. Now, because we're not using APIs, what we can do is actually dictate or allow our customers to dictate to row and column what they actually want to grab and really focus on least privilege. So to sum that up, what we're doing is next gen compliance automation for enterprises, and no one else is really doing it. The reason it's important is you save all that time and stress and difficulty in collecting evidence. You consolidate into one place. You have the evidence and a complete record of historical evidence. Your top tier auditors or any auditor can come into the platform, see the evidence, know that you've automated the collection thereof, and sort the audit out as quickly and as seamlessly as possible. So that's in a nutshell what we do and why we're different. We're disrupting because we're thinking differently.
Yeah. Now, if we bring in a bit, I guess just good, I guess, to view from different angles. Now, if we bring back to the GRC role as itself, How do you think the role itself is evolving over the, recent years, especially when we're talking about, complexities of digital transformation, and especially we're talking about remote work? How do you see that direction of travel, and where does the role is going?
I think there's two answers to that question. I think there's where it is going, which I think is a bit stagnant, and where I'd like to see it going. And part of what we're part of, hopefully, the revolution of doing that. I think you've seen difficulties and increasing complexity over time, right? I was a CISO at single store during COVID when we scaled from like 100 people to like 500 people in the space of like a year. And trying to monitor that when everyone was suddenly remote, including myself, was incredibly difficult.
Yep.
And the GRC aspects of that are very difficult because you've suddenly got a lot of people working on phones. So why is the laptop not logging in? And therefore, are they using MDM and is security in place? And there's suddenly infrastructure spinning up all over the place in different time zones. And is that a breach, or is that just normal behavior for people working in the Philippines? Like, there's all kinds of stuff going on that doesn't seem normal. So I think that remote working is one thing that's added to complexity for GRC. The second is regulations are going crazy, right? As soon as you've got your head around one regulation, there's another one. So we've just got to our heads around one thing, like maybe AI is the latest one, right? And 42001 in ISO. Well, NIST 2 comes into play really in October this year, and that's a completely different framework that's relevant to, again, AI and technology-driven companies. So I think there's a lot of different changes in regulation, and what that's doing between them is putting a lot of pressure on GRC to deliver in what is an almost impossible task. In terms of the role, I think it's still pretty stagnant, right? It's the working with business owners to try and get the evidence that you want from the people that have it, put it into one place, make sure it matches the control requirements, work with the auditors to make sure the audit's passed, and rinse and repeat. Now, what we want to do and what Anecdotes are part of is saying, look, that's boring, right? That is hard and boring.
Yeah.
Let's automate it so that your GRC people can focus on the hard stuff, which is remediating the issues, risk management, and fixing things that you flag in GRC. Let's focus time, effort, and intelligence on dealing with real problems, where now we spend most of our time, effort, and semi-intelligence in just keeping the bus turning, right? Keeping the bus running on time. So I think that's really, for me, the role has got harder but stagnated in terms of what you're doing. We really want to kind of free that blockage and allow people to act in a different way and responding to a different environment.
I think important thing, I think, as well to mention, in terms of, I think, evolution of the role and how things are progressing. Compliance, or even, GRC or aspects of GRC in terms of risk management and governance, it's always been sort of, and when you look from some of the regulation point of view, or some even certification schemes, it's sort of point in time assessment. And usually it does not really scale with time, and people sometimes forget, for example, you have ISO, requirements that says, oh, you need to do a pen test once a year. Now, once you've done the pen test once a year, the rest 364 days, that pen test becomes irrelevant, because if you're deploying code daily, now your environment is constantly changing. So your compliance might not, be relevant a couple of weeks down the line. So do you think that with proliferation of tools and this sort of expansion of, automation, it allows us to do continuous GRC, where I think that's where we potentially should be going, and when you start out, yes, it's okay to do, spreadsheets and stuff like that, but that obviously becomes very quickly legacy point of view, and because we keep thinking about once in time assessments.
100%. Look, Anecdotes is geared to be data-driven and continuous compliance. And I think it's important why that matters, right? Historically, compliance only mattered to people who were in regulated spaces. So banks, government, healthcare, they were required to do this annually just to prove a point. It changed a lot when the rise of SaaS and then cloud-based stuff, when suddenly now anyone who works in tech, full stop, or actually anyone who provides a service is required to do this as part of their sales cycle, right? You can't sell a tech product without having SOC 2 or an ISO cert. So at that point, you had to start doing this work. And I think the reason for continuous is because otherwise it's meaningless.
Yep.
Like, you need to have data that's changing, that's real. I'll give you an example. So look, I'm a big runner. I think we talked about this at Garden Pie weeks ago. But so I ran a 4-hour marathon 2 years ago, the London Marathon. And I aimed to do a 3-hour marathon this year, just gone, in the London Marathon. Now, that's quite a lot of time. That's 25% of my marathon time. And a 4-hour marathon is accomplishable by a decent runner. A 3-hour is a pretty high peak for anybody.
Yep.
So for me, it's all about then how do you then work on getting from that to that, right? There's 2 different points there. And data is the key. So I use an app, and I'm plugging all kinds of stuff here. I use an app called Runner, which focuses workouts based on your capability and based on your goals to give you a set of things of like long runs and easy runs and sprint runs and like tempo runs. But what the key is here is you are seeing every week how you perform in those sessions versus the goals and objectives you have for each session. And the application is recycling and relearning and reforecasting what you're capable of based on what you did. So over the course of like, I think I did about 6 months, I went from being what was forecast as a 4-hour marathon pace to forecast as a 3:10, and I ran a 3:09, which tells me that the data is, I mean, I didn't get to my 3, I'll still get there. But what tells me is the data is almost perfect, right? I was literally bang on for my time of where I should be. But that's the same way in compliance, right? You having a SOC 2 here to you having a SOC 2 here, there's a long way in between. And a lot's going to change in your business. We work in tech businesses where stuff changes all the day, like every day. So what you need to do is make sure that the position and posture that you're telling your customers, your stakeholders, your other entities about has to be continuous and real to what you currently are, at least for the last few days. Otherwise, like, think of the risk. Let's look at SolarWinds. Let's look at Uber. Let's look at all these breaches where people are now standing in front of Congress in the US, having to answer questions about their security posture. Well, a lot of it comes down to the fact they said one thing, and 6 months later, the reality was different. Now, if your compliance posture is being continuously analyzed and real time, you are maintaining the same posture here as you got certified for here, meaning that you can actually say with confidence, what I say is true.
Yeah, I always use similar examples, when I go gym, for example. So a similar thing as well, is in order to continuously improve, you need to track your progress or track what you're doing.
Exactly.
Now, if somebody says, how many reps you did 3 weeks ago, I can tell you what weight and what reps I did because I'm tracking, and that's how you can continuously improve. If you don't, how? And I think the important thing is that when you say SolarWinds, Ubers, and all of these companies, I think one thing that we need to probably change the mindset or the way people have been talking lately is we keep talking about, cybersecurity basics or cybersecurity hygiene or, yes, we can call it basics, but it's not basics because when you're talking about 20, 30,000 employees, even basics are very, very hard, such as MFA established when you have 20,000 employees and you go all kinds of legacy systems. If you don't have even such a simple thing as, asset management, all things can run away from you very easily, just missing one machine.
And you can't know what you don't know. You look at the classic example in SolarWinds, right? Tim Brown, who I've met a couple of times, right? One of his problems is they said you have a password policy, but not every single user for every single application is using this in the company. Therefore, what you said is negligent or fraudulent. Well, I'm sorry, like as a CISO of a company of thousands of people, how do you know if some guys created some dodgy password in one application? Like it's very hard to get everything under monitoring. Even down to like AWS, they said about shared credentials. There's no way to realistically track for shared credentials. It's very hard. I mean, there is ways, but it's very hard to do.
Yeah.
So the reality is that you're right. Like you've got to track to the nth degree. And it comes back to me, GRC to some people seems like the fluffy part of security, right? It's the part which is like, meh, it's up in the fairies, right? Yeah. The reality is it's now the foundation. Like everything beyond that are technical components of how you secure a building, secure an application, secure a house, whatever you want to like use as the analogy. But you've got to have like this part where you're able to see and understand what everything's built on. Like it comes back to knowing what you know. The reality is GRC is the broadest way to see your security world.
Yeah, and I think especially another thing, which is I think is becoming hard in some ways as well, because, I think security we are involving in terms of, doing communications and becoming sort of that department where we allow to, it's not like, back in the day, you just say that security said that and that's end of it. Now we sort of, becoming a bit of in that place where, because yes, you can put all of the controls under the sun, but that means that you're stopping the business from achieving its goals. And that's where the difficult part becomes of balancing how much you allow it and how much you block it versus, then, as you say, standing in front of Congress because you missed some specific application that had something.
100%. And like, that's the difficult part we get into now where even 5 years ago, it was okay for you to be a cost center. Security says no, security protects us. Great. It's not anymore. Like I think every security leader right now has got to become a profit center. And that means they're saying yes, but, or saying yes, and trying to find a way to facilitate something. Because I'll tell you one thing for me, which is a categorical fact. The quicker you say no, the quicker you have shadow IT, the quicker you have shadow IT, the quicker you have a data breach. Right. So like saying no for me is the quickest way to get to a data breach because people will do it anyway. So you've got to find a way to actually get embedded into the culture where people actually see you as someone who gives guidance and advisory counsel to help them do the things that they want to do to achieve their business objectives. And therefore, you as a department and leader, as a member of the ELT, are actually helping the company achieve its business objectives, not hindering progress, which is historically how we would see.
Yeah. I just wanted to segue into another thing as well, because that dawned to me as well. You obviously went from being, client CISO to being now a vendor CISO. So on that journey, do you think that, because, I know industry's been talking for a while now about how in some ways organization sort of sale processes are broken, how, cold reaching and, sort of outreach is broken as well. Do you think that sort of organizations are probably thinking along the lines of, hiring CISOs because it potentially allows to talk the CISO language and understand what are the requirements on the other side?
Look, I think there's lots of things. I think the reality is that when you're a vendor CISO, you kind of wear like a leopard bell almost. You walk into a room and people are like, oh, he's the vendor CISO, right? The
Yeah.
reality is CISOs are CISOs, right? I've been a pen tester, I've been a consultant, I've been a VP, a head of, and a CISO. I've built and scaled security programs for mid to large enterprise as well as startups. Vendor or not, security is the same. In fact, it's probably harder to be a security leader in a vendor than a non-vendor, because in the end, it's not just our reputation, but our entire revenue stream stacks on us being able to show that we're secure. Otherwise, you can't be a security vendor and be insecure, right? It's inherently wrong. So I think there's part of that. But I think, yeah, why do vendors want CISOs? Either in direct CISO roles doing that, or doing kind of field CISO type roles where they're going to the kind of sales and in turn into business. I think there's a couple of points. I think one is credibility. Of course, you're buying the ability to speak the language. But I think at the same time, that's not just about like snake oil sales. That's about the fact that you actually understand when there is and when there isn't a problem. Like, you know who this will make sense to and who it won't make sense to. Right? And being able to have that communication and being able to be like a trusted advisor that says, look, if it's not right for you, don't buy Anecdotes. There's better products if you're this kind of customer. There's better products if you're that kind of customer. If you're here, oh yeah, you're in our sweet spot. Like, you should POC it and we'll win. Right. But it's knowing the in-between and being able to say, and also this is implementation problem. Or for me, like, I was previously an Anecdotes customer a few times. So I come with the experience of being able to say, well, actually, I didn't just come here to help sell the product. I bought the product. Like, I get it. I get why it helps.
Yeah.
I think that's one. I think the second part is also joining the dots. So engineering teams, particularly in vendors, like to build, any team likes to build what they think is cool and sexy. And that doesn't mean that the customer thinks that's cool and sexy.
No.
So often it's making the dots that say, well, actually, I understand what the customer wants and thinks, and I know what you want and think. So let's try and align those, and trying to get like the business focus on trying to solve the problems that we as security leaders know exist in the industry and in our potential customer or existing customer base, without kind of crossing lines. Like, I think that's the problem. Like, vendor CISOs have a reputation, but the reality is, like, when people say, oh, you're trying to sell your product, well, so are you. Like, if someone comes to you and starts talking about like finance, you'll start trying to sell your product. If they're like a telco or like a reseller, I'm sure you will, right? Like, I just happen to ironically stand and sit in rooms a lot with people who are the customer type for my profile, for like my product. But if you're working for Vodafone and you're in a room of people who are massive entities looking for a new phone contract, no one's having to go with that CISO for selling his product, are they?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's just, finding, I guess, the balance. And
Yeah.
I wanted to delve in a bit about, I think we're always talking about in cybersecurity, we need to talk risk language because that's supposedly what C-suite understands. But now I think the more we talk with C-suite, actually, I don't think all of them understand the risk language. And sometimes I think it's still, CISOs still need to understand how to create a narrative and how to sort of break it down. How do you guys find with your customers? Because what I find as well is, depending on organization maturity, how people do or address risk is very different, because you go small organizations where they might do 3x3 or 5x5 matrix somewhere, with a calculator and a spreadsheet. And then you got someone, I think I was in a San CISO, one of the networking events, and then you go like a big bank who's like, oh, I've got 100 data scientists running Monaco simulations. And that's a whole completely different, scenario when you're talking
That'd be
about risk
helpful.
management. Yeah. So do you find that obviously you guys need to find somewhere a sort of middle ground in Anecdotes to help customers, solve risk?
So I think there's two parts to that question. First is, what does Anecdotes do and what do I think? Anecdotes obviously has a risk management module where we allow people to facilitate risk based on categorization of severity. the financial impact, and be able to model how their business sees risk so they can put it into their dashboard inside of our product and be able to display it back and have those conversations using data points and using ROI and using things that make sense. So I think that we allow customization for customers to portray and demonstrate risk, how their business sees it. Now, I think the wider problem is our inability to be ELTs. So I think one of the biggest problems in CISOs and security leaders is that in the last 10 years, we shot from being nobodies who reported to heads of IT to being members of ELTs in many cases. And many CISOs don't have that skill set. Probably myself included, right? Most people don't have that ability to really act and interact like a CMO, CRO, CEO, CTO level, like to really understand business dynamics and to really understand like how businesses function and work. So I think one of the things that I've learned is to really simplify and drag that back is if I ask for investment and someone says no, right? My simple response is, well, I want investment, not because I want more heads or more tools. I want investment to improve and to mature the risk posture of our business, to mitigate more risk and make us more secure from data breaches. Now, if the answer is no, my response is, so you are completely content and happy with the current risk posture of our business. If the answer is yes, I'll say I want that physically in writing, because if anything goes wrong, you just agreed. Most times, and 9 out of 10 times, the CEO at that point, whoever holds the budget, goes, well, that's not what I said. And I know, well, that's exactly what you said. You said that you're happy with the risk posture. If you're not, you'll give me more money to improve it. So I think that's the point, is we have to work out how to talk to budget holders and senior like leaders in a business in a way that gets them on board. The other way is to flip it and go to revenue drivers. Like you look at stuff like our world, GRC, Anecdotes, right? What do? We help you manage the certification and compliance program of your business. Why is that relevant? Well, here's 2 things I'll tell you as a business leader. Mr. CFO, do you know how much it costs if you breach regulations? It's quite expensive. Like if we can manage you internally and protect you against that risk, does that matter to you? Yes. Right, here's the second one. We have a trust center product that enables you to sell to people in a more transparent way so they can access and pass security reviews quicker. Is improving your sales cycles, times, and efficiencies important to you, Mr. CRO? Guarantee the answer is yes. Fine, this is why it works, right? And that works with any product, whether it's vulnerability management to GRC to MDM. We have to be able to communicate what is the business objective or the revenue driving mechanism for what I'm asking you for, because I guarantee there is one.
Yeah, definitely. And then, if we're talking about how, risk, I guess, profile or posture is changing, I think at the forefront nowadays comes on things like supply chain risk. Because I think obviously there's more and more outsourcing happening. I think even from code point of view, if you're talking about code-based organizations, I think using like 80% something along the line of open source, and then we're talking about, your third party, fourth party vendors, and then, I guess it's very important, I guess, to look at your supply chain. But I think the question becomes, where does the effort stops? Because you can never address all of the third parties, and then you have fourth, fifth parties. How deep do you go? So I guess having a tool, and as you say, being able to be more transparent in the sales cycles, but also I'm sure Anecdotes allows you to easier or frictionless assessment of your potential third parties that you are onboarding, and how does that process work?
So I think let me take off my Anecdotes hat and put on my thoughts hat. I think the whole thing's broken. So I was the former CISO of Wistic, who were a player in the TPRM space who developed best-in-class VRM, so assessing of and responding to vendor questionnaires. And what I recognize in that space is everything's broken. It's all about legal liability. You assess your vendors to say that you did because that's the requirement of SOC 2 or ISO, or that's because if you've assessed them and they've answered yes and they prove to be a no, you're not legally liable for that cost because they said that, and therefore you can hold them up in front of court, right? It's all legal liability. The reality is we have to get to a place where we're more transparent and we're more honest and we're more genuine. Now, we're all terrified of that because if you look, every pen test report is clean. Every SOC 2 report is clean. Every ISO report is clean. That's just not reality. Like I know inside of my business, everyone I've worked in, if you'd asked me the right questions as an auditor, if I'd wanted to give you them, you'd have found problems. Like we wouldn't have failed, but you'd have found problems. Pen test. No one's ever ran a pen test and not. I was a pen tester. No one finishes a pen test and doesn't find anything because you don't get paid. Like, so the reality with these clean pen test reports you see out there, again, complete nonsense. Like the reality is we're scared because no one wants to be the guy that stops you obtaining a customer or loses your contract because your security posture wasn't sufficient. But we need to get to an ecosystem where we're honest and genuine with each other and accept that there is best, right? And that's the reality. Like, this is what I've done. Here's my issues. Here's what I'm doing to work on them. Here's why you should trust me. Shall we continue this conversation? Now, the answer 9 times out of 10 should be yes, because everyone else has issues too. Like, look at all the major companies that have been breached, from the UK to the US and everything in between. Not one of them has not had a SOC or an ISO or a HIPAA or a FedRAMP or a PCI or a pen test. Like, they've all had everything which says they were perfect. So I think that's the problem. Right now, VRM and TPRM is being focused on just ticking a box. It's got to be focused on genuinely getting a risk posture to make a decision if we can operate with and have a relationship with that business. And that has to go from me to my third parties, to the fourth, to the fifth, to the sixth, and beyond, so I can make real decisions. And I'd love, like, for us and other companies to start putting out trust centers and security pages that were real representations of our business in real time. They showed warts and all, but also gave us a reality of what we're trying to do to fix things. I mean, I'm on a bit of a soapbox, so I'll get off, but that's a real bugbear for me.
No, I think definitely you're right. I think similar to what I've been talking with Greg, is like how some of the processes are broken, because if we look at statistics, we keep spending more money on cybersecurity, but the breaches are keep rising because we're not moving the needle in the right direction. And I think things need to change, because too many times we're just firefighting and we are being reactive instead of trying to proactively address issues. And I think that's where I think the conversations, I guess, if we can vary to another interesting topic, because I think there's so many talks now in all of the CISO networks saying that how potentially CISO role is dying is because I think this is partly because of two things. I don't think it's dying, but I think the problem is that either because of reporting lines or their inability to create a narrative and gain influence, they can't achieve things. And loads of people are talking about potentially CISO role evolving in a chief resilience officer role, because we need to be, and I understand, because I think we need to move towards resilience, because your business should be able, we need to get our business in a place where we can maintain business operations while cyber and operational incidents are happening, and we can withstand them and complete business operations. I guess what's your thought on that?
I think the other problem is that I agree with some of it and I disagree with some. Like, if you look at that famous picture of the guy plugging fingers with holes in the wall, right?
Yeah.
No one is increasing those holes as quickly as security is. Like, I look at when I was a consultant advising CISOs and what they had to do versus when I became a CISO and then suddenly gained IT overnight, which I had no idea how to deal with. And then you look at just how roles have changed. Like, let's look at how modern business operates, right? All these SaaS apps, well, that's all my responsibility, apparently. Cloud infra, well, I guarantee the security of that is my responsibility. All development, maintenance, and pushing to prod of code, that's belonging to me. Employee training, signing up of policies, so all of the employee governance and lifecycle and offboarding, that belongs to me. Like, access to any application we've just listed. So Okta versus like machine not identity, that belongs to me. Certifications belongs to me. Assessments of third-party liability and legal reputability with them belongs to me. Like, I'm supposed to help sales. I'm supposed to help CS. Like, you look at all these things that I'm supposed to do as a CISO. I'm probably like 2 or 3 in the business. Like, the reality is the CISO has ended up reporting to a CTO or someone because of maybe their personality type, maybe their business skills, who knows, right? But our role has now become so broad that unless we can get a board to understand and to recognize that, you can't get true recognition and true support for what you're actually doing. Because in reality, you're now covering a massive portion of the business, not just security, but you're actually responsible for huge amounts of stuff.
Yeah. I think if we look at rewind 10 years ago or so, CISO was predominantly securing the IT department.
That
Now,
was easy. Securing a data center was easy.
Yeah, but because I think proliferation and how digital expanded into every single department, we are covering everything from securing HR to finance to, as you say, from covering all of these aspects. I just wanted to touch a bit. We can never go away without talking about AI, but we talked a bit about automation and AI, and I guess I wanted to see how Anecdotes is addressing automation as well as AI into implementation? Because there are obviously examples, and obviously we can always see memes how they say you shouldn't do GRC with AI, but I think it's always depends how you do it, because yes, there can be hallucinations where it doesn't answer correct, but it's all about based on the data you provide or based on how you build all of those tools, isn't it?
I think it's use cases, right? But my problem with AI is inherently not new. I was at IBM when they released Watson, and that was over 10 years ago. And that wasn't new at that point. That was the newest iteration of AI. So like AI isn't new. Generative AI isn't new. So I think what we have to do is get away from the buzzword and say, what am I using LLMs for effectively to develop and improve the services or offerings of my product? Now, I think there's a few cases. So you spoke to automation first. So the reality is that we already ingest data from applications, map it to a control, and effectively answer the control with the data there. That doesn't require AI. That's just an automated workflow that says, look for this and pull the evidence from it. If the evidence says this, then answer this, right? That's not hard. I think there's AI inherently in things like trust centers. So your public posture of your security data that's being pulled from anecdotes and other sources, queryability of that, upload 10 questions, upload 600 questions, have them answered using generative AI, quote the source, quote the surety of that answer, right? That's not hard. I think we look at that. I think one thing we look at, which is quite interesting, and SolarWinds is a great case. So SolarWinds just got thrown out in the Supreme Court, well, partly thrown out. All the stuff around Tim Brown's policies, right? They said he was fraudulent because he said we do A, B, C, D, and E, but the reality was different. Now, one thing that didn't get thrown out was the actual policy itself. They said you've shared this policy with customers and stakeholders and publicly on your trust center, but you couldn't guarantee that those controls that are in that policy are actually effective in the business. The one thing we're doing at Anecdotes is saying, well, why don't we just do that? Right? Forget like just saying, here's your framework SOC 2. Let's take Maris's security policy, let's upload it into Anecdotes, and let's cross-map it to every control that we have in place to say, here's all the controls in your security policy. Here's evidence from your applications that those are currently in place and active. By the way, Maris, here's 3 things you say in security policy that we can't find evidence for. Either upload them manually, or we've got a problem. You've got to work out what you're doing because it says that you're not doing what you say you're doing, right? So I think that's a good use case. For us, a lot of it is about cross-mapping. So like Anecdotes party pieces around the fact that we can cross-map evidence to framework standards and custom stuff in a way no one else can. Like I can say it with confidence, if we POC in that space, we win every time. And we're wanting to enhance that with AI even more to say that as soon as you touch a piece of evidence into our atmosphere, we'll tell you everywhere it applies. So every framework, regulation, certification, every one of your policies, every customer contract, everywhere you can possibly link it to, we'll tell you where it goes and show how it links. So for us, AI is not about a buzzword. It's about how do we make what we're already offering more efficient, more effective, more appealing. I think that's what you've got to do with AI, right? You can't just say we've got AI for AI's sake.
Yeah, well, so some companies do, but they get burned after it. Obviously, as we kind of touched and talked a bit about, you obviously get to talk to a lot of CISOs. What do you think, or if you can sum up in a couple of words, what do you think are the biggest fears that CISOs faced in a GRC space?
The biggest fear is your known unknown, the things I don't know that I don't know. Again, I want to come back always to Tim Brown and SolarWinds. If you don't know what people are doing, it's very hard for you to say publicly that you are doing it. That leads into my second biggest fear, not just the unknown unknowns, but the things that you have to declare and say publicly that you can't guarantee with 100% surety. That keeps me up at night. That scares me. I think for me, machine IDs or non-human IDs, we're calling it, is an area with big concern, like the risk of my own critical infrastructure becoming a botnet overnight because it was poorly configured or not properly managed, and how much stuff is existing in there. Then I think specifically to GRC, a couple are regulations change overnight. There's always new regulations. We have to get on top of those. We have to get better at syncing with a more diverse app stack so we can actually produce automated and continuous evidence in a more effective way. I think we also just have to learn how to manage risk inside of GRC. What we're great at is what we're great at in security, full stop, is spotting problems, right? Vulnerabilities, easy to find. Like non-compliances in GRC, easy to find. Actually fixing them, that's another problem. So I think the biggest fear for me, I think that CISOs have in GRC is that the more risks I find, the more problems I've got that I don't know how to fix. And I think we need to, as companies like us, we need to help people actually not just identify, but remediate. And as thought leaders, we need to talk more about how do you mitigate risks after you've identified them. Because I think there's a fear to identify a risk based on the fact that you then have it on your risk register. And if you can't fix it, you've now just got another risk. And if you're bad at reporting to your executive team, you now just sound worse at your job.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest problem that happens is that, as you say, as you keep uncovering, risks, is how do you articulate, and the thing is, you have to get, and that's why I guess sometimes security professionals lack expertise because you need to be very embedded into the business and understand sort of at the ground level what each risk means. Because as I always talk to people, based on the business, each business has different risk tolerance based on their current sort of goals or current sort of maturity levels, because risk tolerance changes. For example, I work for a startup business where we are trying to grab, expand our market share. So I think you take a bit more risks. Then when you get into a maturity or you have more regulations, you obviously are a bit less probably risk taking. So I think that's very important thing to understand, and then how you narrate that to your C-suite is an important skill that you need to develop.
I think aligning risk tolerance too, right? Like often the CEO and the CRO's risk tolerance is very high because they want to grow the business, but their risk tolerance can only be as high as I'm willing to let it be, right? And that's not me going back to saying as a no man, but like in the end, if they take risks that I'm not comfortable with, I've either got to speak up about them or I've got to find a way to get comfortable with them. So I think that a lot of it often is that we actually don't speak enough about how we align risk. We present a risk register, people sign off and agree on it because it's required under ISO. But like we actually don't talk about, well, this risk level is A, and we said our risk level was B. So what do we do now? Like I think that's an important conversation, like, and actually justifying that risk. You can't always just say, well, we're trying to grow the business, so our risk appetite is high. Because at the same time, if you're trying to grow the business into an enterprise space and deal with really high-end enterprise Fortune or kind of FTSE companies, your risk appetite can't be high because they're not going to do anything with you if you have too high a risk appetite.
Yeah, I think you're right, and sometimes even looking at risks from different angles or different like departments' perspectives. Because if you look at finance risk, what finance risk potentially means one thing for the finance department, but it potentially, if it impacts compliance or regulations and things like that, then obviously it has completely different angles. So I think just to sum it up, we kind of touched a few things about. I think one thing I wanted to touch as well, and I think it's important to kind of touch on anecdotes, was that we talked about when you grow a business. I think the challenges happen is various regulations, and obviously when you talk in different geographies, then you have different competing requirements based on regulations. And how does anecdotes help you address that? Because the problem is, I think you can have a mature sort of GRC function, but as soon as you start expanding and adding, all of a sudden 5, 6 new geographies, it can become overwhelming.
Yeah, there's two parts to that, right? There is the part by how you segment your compliance view or kind of window, and there is the regulations themselves. I think on the first one, you can segment, right? Maybe you look at the business as a compliance overall. Maybe you don't. Maybe you look at compliance as a difference between Australia, the UK, the EU, and the US. We can segment that by business unit or by geography and say, here's your compliance status for each of those individual areas. So that's
Yep.
part one. That's not hard. The second part is regulations themselves. Everyone knows there's at least 60% crossover between virtually all security frameworks, if not higher than that. So as soon as you bring a new framework in for Australia or Canada or India or the China security law, again, the evidence that exists in the platform will cross map to that framework and tell you where you are and say, well, this is where you are right now. Here's the extra controls you need. If you connect these apps, you'll meet them all. If you don't have those apps, upload these manual things and we'll show you what you've got. Right. So basically my answer is it's not hard. Like we
Yep.
are delivered and we're built and designed to do exactly what you're talking about. And we're probably, again, one of the better ones at doing it, because if you want your evidence driven and it's all about the evidence, not about the end result, then actually layering more and more things on top is not hard because your source is always here and it can spread more and more branches.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing, as you say. If when you have a tool that allows you to cross map and straight away see out of the box where you are, I think that's a big help now. And then just to finish, I guess looking ahead, at the future trends in sort of GRC space, how anecdotes are preparing to meet the sort of tomorrow's enterprise needs.
I think there's a few things to that. I think one is we partner, and that might sound weird, right? But we're not always actually trying to sell anecdotes per se. So
Mm.
like we recognize that a lot of enterprises are never coming off of ServiceNow or SAP or these legacy ginormous platforms because you know what? They didn't buy them. They're worth like $5 million deals. Someone else in the business bought them. So what anecdotes does, which is clever, which a lot of people don't, is we sell a data entry component. Does that make sense? So what we actually do is say, use ServiceNow, great. we can actually ingest data and represent it into ServiceNow. You'll never even know Anecdotes was there. So we can enable your platform that you already have and you're never going to get rid of to be automated, to be modern, to be next gen. So I think that's number one. We're future-proofing ourselves by saying there is a market of customers out there who want automation but physically can't buy it. So I think that's number one. Number two is we need to get better and quicker at regulations. So like I said, they keep coming. We're using AI models to say, if you bring a new one in, how quick can you basically compare and contrast yourself against it? And how do we build commercial models that say we're not going to charge you per framework or per standard, but we're going to charge you for the product. So if you want to gap assess against 10 frameworks tomorrow in 10 different geographies, Marius, you're not going to pay a penny more or $1 more, whatever, right? So I think that's a commercial version.
Yeah.
And then technologically, I think we should have to get better at involving more and more of the tech stack. So no matter how good your integrations are, and ours is in the hundreds, you've always got more applications that are coming out there more relevant to CISOs and more relevant to regulation. So as long as you then keep on top of the regulations, the technology, and the ICP or the potential buyer, and follow where their trend is going, I think you're all right. I think we're pretty good at doing that right now.
Okay, brilliant. Well, that's the episode, and thank you very much for coming along, Jake. I think it's always important to to look at cybersecurity is such a vast space. I've been talking with pen testing, CISOs, all kinds of different companies, and GRC is obviously one space that you can definitely not overlook. And as you say, it's like a foundation, making sure that you get your documentation and sort of governance compliance right makes you in a good stead to do all the rest of it that you need to do.
Definitely. Marius, absolute pleasure. Always love chatting to you.
Brilliant. Thank you for coming along, and that's our episode.
Take care.